Tom Brennan thought he was riding out to catch horse thieves. Nothing more than another hard day tracking rustlers across the Texas panhandle in the summer of 18. The black stranger who'd knocked on his door at dawn had warned him about stolen horses, pointed toward Devil's Canyon, and offered to ride along as guide. 3 days later, when they found the hidden camp tucked into the canyon's shadow, it wasn't horses they discovered. It was a dozen children, white and Mexican and Indian, all of them chained like cattle in a makeshift pen. The stranger's rifle spoke first, dropping 2 guards before Tom's hand even found his gun. By the time the smoke cleared and the children were free, Tom understood why this man had really come to his ranch. The horses were just bait. The real hunt had been for something far worse than rustlers, and now Tom Brennan was part of it, whether he wanted to be or not. But that morning, when the stranger first appeared at his door, Tom had no idea what he was walking into. The knock came before sunrise, sharp and insistent against the weathered pine of his front door. Tom rolled out of his bunk, pulled on his boots, and grabbed the Winchester from above the fireplace. Dawn was still an hour off, and honest folks didn't come calling in the dark. "What do you want?" he called through the door, not bothering to hide the barrel of his rifle. "Name's Samuel Washington," came the voice from outside. "Got word your horse has been stolen." Tom's blood chilled. He'd been to the corral last night, counted every head, 16 horses all present. But this stranger knew something Tom didn't, and that knowledge sent ice through his veins. He opened the door slowly, keeping the rifle ready. The man standing on his porch was tall and lean, maybe 40 years old, with skin dark as coffee, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a dusty black coat and a hat pulled low, but Tom could see the careful way he held himself, like a man who'd learned to be ready for anything. "My horses are right where I left them," Tom said. Samuel Washington smiled, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Check again, Mr. Brennan." "I'll wait." Tom backed into his cabin, never taking his eyes off the stranger, then moved to his window. The corral sat 50 yards away, just visible in the pre-dawn gloom. He counted once, twice, then felt his stomach drop. 8 horses, half his herd was gone. When he opened the door again, Washington was still there, patient as death. "How'd you know?" Tom asked. "Saw them being driven south yesterday evening. 4 men, moving fast toward Devil's Canyon. They'll be making camp about now, dividing up the stock." Washington stepped closer, and Tom saw the butt of a well-maintained Colt at his hip. "I can take you to them, if you want your horses back." Tom studied the stranger's face in the growing light. There was something about the man that didn't quite fit. His speech was too educated for a drifter, his clothes too good for a cowpoke, and his manner too confident for someone who should be worried about being on a white man's land uninvited. "Why would you help me?" Tom asked. "Let's just say those men took something of mine too." Tom knew he should be cautious. A black man showing up at dawn with information about stolen horses, it smelled like trouble. But 16 horses represented his entire livelihood, and if this Washington fellow could lead him to the thieves, Tom was willing to listen. "You know Devil's Canyon?" Tom asked. "Better than most." That decided. Devil's Canyon was 20 miles of broken rock and hidden draws, perfect country for men who didn't want to be found. Tom could spend weeks searching and never locate a hidden camp. But if this stranger knew the territory, "Give me 10 minutes to saddle up," Tom said. Washington nodded. "I'll wait by the corral, and Mr. Brennan, bring extra ammunition." By the time Tom had saddled his bay gelding and packed his saddlebags, the sun was painting the eastern sky red. Washington sat his own horse, a fine black stallion that must have cost more than Tom made in 6 months, with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. They rode south without much conversation, following the clear trail left by the stolen horses. Tom found himself stealing glances at his companion, trying to figure out what didn't add up. The man rode like cavalry, sat his horse like someone who'd covered serious ground, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a professional. But he was black, riding free across Texas in 1885, acting like he owned the world. "You're not from around here," Tom said after an hour of silence. "No, sir. Come up from Austin. Long way to ride about stolen horses." Washington was quiet for a moment, studying the trail ahead. "Sometimes you have to ride a long way to do what's right." They followed the horse tracks through country that grew rougher by the hour. The land here was broken and wild, cut by arroyos and dotted with stands of scrub oak. Good country for men who wanted to disappear. Around midday they stopped to rest the horses at a creek crossing. Tom knelt to fill his canteen while Washington studied the muddy bank. 4 riders, just like I said, but look here. Washington pointed to a set of different tracks in the soft earth. Wagon heavy loaded by the look of it. Tom frowned. Horse thieves didn't usually travel with wagons. Maybe they're planning to sell quick, needed something to haul gear. Maybe, but Washington's voice carried doubt. Or maybe they're hauling something else entirely. They pushed on through the afternoon, the land growing more desolate with each mile. By evening they could see Devil's Canyon opening before them like a wound in the earth. The stolen horse's trail led straight toward its mouth. We'll camp here, Washington said, reining in his horse at the canyon's rim. Go in at first light, when the shadows are long and we can move without being seen. Tom hobbled his horse and gathered wood for a fire, but Washington stopped him with a raised hand. No fire tonight. Don't want to announce we're coming. They made a cold camp, sharing jerky and water while the sun died behind them. In the growing darkness, Tom found himself studying his companion again. There was something about the way Washington moved, the way he constantly scanned their surroundings, that reminded Tom of soldiers he'd known during the war. You serve in the army, Tom. Washington was quiet for so long that Tom thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, Buffalo Soldiers, 10th Cavalry. Did my time on the frontier, chasing Apaches and keeping the peace. That explained the horsemanship and the easy confidence with firearms. The Buffalo Soldiers had earned respect, even from white officers, who wanted nothing to do with black troops. They were professionals, and Washington carried himself like one. What brought you to Austin? Tom asked. Again that long pause. Work. Different kind of work than the army, but similar goals. Tom was about to press for details when Washington held up his hand for silence. They sat frozen, listening to the night sounds of the canyon country. Somewhere in the distance, Tom caught the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. They're down there, Washington whispered. Tomorrow, we'll see what they're really up to. Tom settled back against his saddle, but sleep wouldn't come easy. Something about this whole situation felt wrong. Horse thieves were one thing. Every rancher dealt with rustlers sooner or later. But the wagon tracks, Washington's mysterious background, and the careful way the man avoided direct answers all pointed to something bigger than simple theft. As he finally drifted off, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to walk into more trouble than he'd bargained for. The stolen horses were just the beginning. Tomorrow, in Devil's Canyon, he'd learn what Samuel Washington was really hunting. And he'd discover that some things were far worse than having your livelihood stolen in the night. Tom woke to find Washington already moving, checking his weapons with the methodical precision of a man who expected to use them. The eastern rim of Devil's Canyon glowed pale gold in the pre-dawn light, but down in its depths, shadows still ruled. Sleep well? Washington asked, not looking up from his colt. Well enough. Tom stretched the stiffness from his back and reached for his rifle. You been awake long? Long enough to do some scouting. Washington pointed toward the canyon mouth. They're camped about 2 miles down near where the canyon splits. 4 men like we figured. But there's more. Tom felt his stomach tighten. More men. More wagons. At least 3, maybe 4. And they're not just holding stolen horses, Mr. Brennan. They're holding people. The words hit Tom like a physical blow. People. Washington finally looked at him, and Tom saw something dangerous burning in the man's dark eyes. Children. I counted at least a dozen through my field glass. All of them chained up like their cargo. Tom's blood went cold. He'd heard whispers of such things. Children taken from isolated homesteads, Indian kids stolen from reservations, Mexican children grabbed from border villages, sold like livestock to mining camps, or railroad gangs where no one asked questions about where workers came from. Jesus, Tom breathed. Jesus has nothing to do with this. Washington's voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made smart men step back. This is the devil's own work, and we're about to shut it down. Tom understood now why Washington had really come to his ranch. The stolen horses weren't the target. They were just the excuse to get an armed white man to ride along. Because a black man, even an ex-soldier, couldn't approach a slave camp alone and expect to survive long enough to do any good. You knew, Tom said, About the children. You knew before you ever knocked on my door. Washington nodded. I've been tracking this operation for 3 months, Austin to Dallas to San Antonio, following the rumors and the disappearances. This camp is where the trails all lead. What kind of work did you say you did in Austin? For the first time since they'd met, Washington smiled, and this time there was something genuine in it. The kind that pays well but doesn't look good on a church resume. Let's leave it at that. Tom checked his Winchester, made sure his sidearm was loaded, and tried to wrap his mind around what they were riding into. 4 armed men, maybe more. Children to protect, and somewhere in the middle of it all, his stolen horses, though they seemed like the least important part of the equation now. What's the plan? He asked. Washington pulled out a piece of paper, sketched quickly in the dirt. Canyon splits into 3 drawers about 2 miles. They're camped in the middle drawer, where there's water and cover. Guards posted at the mouth, probably 1 or 2 more in camp. That's a lot of guns for 2 men to handle. It is, but we have advantages. Washington pointed to the canyon walls, high ground, surprise, and the fact that they won't be expecting anyone to come calling. Most folks avoid Devil's Canyon, and for good reason. Tom studied the rough map. What about the children? Soon as shooting starts, they're in danger. That's why we do this careful and quiet. Take out the guards first, then move on the camp before they know we're there. Washington looked up at Tom, and his expression was deadly serious. I won't lie to you, Mr. Brennan. This is dangerous work. These men won't surrender, and they won't show mercy if they get the drop on us. You still want your horses back? Tom thought about it for all of 10 seconds. He'd come this far, and the idea of children chained up like animals made his blood boil. Let's go get them. They led their horses down into the canyon, moving carefully through the loose rock and scattered brush. The walls rose high on either side, red stone that seemed to sweat in the growing heat. Tom had never liked confined spaces, and Devil's Canyon felt like riding into a grave. Washington moved like smoke ahead of him, every step calculated to avoid loose stones or snapping branches. The man had definitely learned his trade in hostile country, where a careless sound could mean death. After an hour of careful progress, Washington held up his hand. They were approaching the split in the canyon, where 3 drawers opened like fingers. Tom could smell wood smoke and hear the distant sound of voices. There, Washington whispered, pointing to an outcrop of rock that overlooked the middle drawer. We'll get a good view from up there. Plan our approach. They climbed carefully, leaving the horses tied in a stand of scrub oak. The rock was hot under Tom's hands, already baking in the morning sun. When they reached the top, Tom's stomach clenched at what he saw below. The camp sat in a natural amphitheater, sheltered by high walls and blessed with a spring that fed a small pool. 3 wagons were arranged in a rough triangle, their canvas covers pulled tight. A dozen horses were corralled in a makeshift pen. Tom recognized 6 of his own animals among them. But it was the other pen that made his hands shake with rage. A rough enclosure built from wagon parts and rope held at least 15 children, the youngest maybe 6 years old, the oldest perhaps 14. White kids, Mexican kids, Indian kids, all of them dirty and scared and chained at the ankles to prevent escape. 4 men moved through the camp with casual brutality, kicking at children who moved too slowly, cursing in languages that made Tom's ears burn. One of them wore the remnants of a cavalry uniform. Another looked like a drifter who'd seen too much hard country. All of them were armed. My God, Tom whispered. Washington was studying the camp through a small telescope, marking guard positions and weapon placements with the cold efficiency of a military scout. 2 guards at the canyon mouth, 2 more in camp. The one in uniform looks like their leader. How do we do this? Washington lowered the telescope and looked at Tom with eyes that held no mercy. We kill them all. Every last one. Men who steal children don't deserve the courtesy of surrender. Tom had killed during the war, and he'd shot his share of rustlers and claim jumpers in the years since. But this felt different. This was execution, plain and simple. I understand if that's not something you can do, Washington said quietly. But I won't take the chance of one of these bastards escaping to set up shop somewhere else. Tom looked down at the children in their makeshift prison, saw the hopelessness in their young faces, and felt something hard and cold settle in his chest. Tell me what you need me to do. Washington smiled, and this time it was the expression of a predator showing his teeth. The guards at the canyon mouth first. We take them quiet, then move on the camp. Once we start shooting, it's going to be fast and loud. They spent another hour watching the camp, learning the guards' patterns and timing their movements. Tom found himself studying Washington as much as the terrain below. The man moved with practiced precision, missed nothing, and radiated a cold competence that spoke of serious training and hard experience. "You're not just some ex-soldier looking for work, are you?" Tom asked during a quiet moment. Washington was quiet for a long time, watching the camp below. Finally, "There are men in this country who make money from other people's misery. They steal children, sell women, trade in human flesh like it was cattle. The law can't touch them. They're too smart, too well connected, too careful to operate where civilized authority can reach. So sometimes the law needs help. Sometimes it needs people willing to ride into places like Devil's Canyon and do what needs doing, regardless of whether it's strictly legal or not." Tom understood. Washington wasn't just an ex-soldier, he was a bounty hunter, or something even more unofficial, someone paid to clean up messes that ordinary law enforcement couldn't handle. Who pays for work like that? Washington's smile was grim. People who've lost children. People who believe some things are worth more than money or legal nicety. People who understand that evil doesn't police itself. The sun was climbing higher, and the heat in the canyon was becoming oppressive. Tom could see that the guards were getting lazy, seeking shade and paying less attention to their surroundings. "Time to move," Washington said. "You ready for this, Mr. Brennan?" Tom checked his weapons one more time, said a quick prayer, and nodded. "Let's go get those children." They began their careful descent toward the canyon floor, where 4 men waited to die and 15 children waited to learn whether hell had an end. The first guard died without making a sound. Washington moved like death itself, slipping through the shadows at the canyon mouth with his knife ready. Tom watched from 30 yards away as the man simply folded over, Washington's hand across his mouth, laid between his ribs. The body disappeared into the brush like it had never existed. The second guard was smoking, leaning against a boulder with his rifle propped beside him. Washington approached from behind, and Tom saw the brief struggle, a flash of steel, a muffled grunt, then silence. 2 men down and the camp still drowsed in the midday heat. Washington waved Tom forward, and they moved deeper into the canyon, following the narrow trail that led to the hidden camp. Tom's hands were slick with sweat on his rifle stock, and his heart hammered so loud he was sure someone would hear it. But when they rounded the last bend and saw the camp spread before them, everything changed. The children were gone. The makeshift pen sat empty, chains and ropes scattered across the ground. The wagons were being loaded with desperate efficiency, and Tom counted 6 men instead of 4. 2 more had arrived while they were dealing with the guards. "Shit," Washington breathed. "They're moving out." Tom could see the children now being herded toward the wagons like livestock. Some were crying, others moved with the dull resignation of people who'd given up hope. The youngest, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7, stumbled and fell. One of the men kicked her in the ribs to get her moving. Something snapped inside Tom Brennan. His Winchester spoke before Washington could stop him, the shot echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The man who'd kicked the child spun around, clutching his shoulder, and the camp exploded into chaos. "So much for quiet," Washington muttered, but his Colt was already in his hand. The slavers scrambled for cover, shouting orders and trying to figure out where the attack was coming from. One man, the one in the cavalry uniform, started screaming at his men to secure the children while he grabbed a rifle from the nearest wagon. Tom's second shot took that man center mass, dropping him in the dust. But now the remaining slavers knew where their attackers were positioned, and bullets began chipping rock around them. "Move," Washington shouted. "They've got us pinned." They scrambled down into the camp itself, using the wagons as cover while lead flew around them like angry hornets. Tom dove behind the water trough, felt bullets punch through the wood inches from his head. Washington had found cover behind one of the wagons, and Tom could hear his Colt speaking steadily, measured shots, each one carefully aimed. Another slaver screamed and went down, but there were still too many of them, and now they were using the children as human shields, forcing the captives to stand between themselves and Tom's rifle. "Can't get a clean shot," Tom called out. "I know," Washington's voice carried frustrated rage. "These bastards are smarter than I hoped." One of the slavers, a tall man with a scar across his face, had taken position behind the group of children. He held a little Mexican boy in front of him like a shield, pistol pressed to the child's head. "You boys made a mistake coming here," the man called out. "Drop your weapons and ride out, or I start killing kids." Tom felt sick. They'd come to rescue these children, but their attack had made things worse. Now the slavers were cornered and desperate, which made them more dangerous than ever. "What do we do, Tom?" Washington was quiet for a moment, studying the situation with professional calm. "Only one thing we can do, make them think they've won." Before Tom could ask what he meant, Washington stood up, hands raised, his Colt conspicuously holstered. "All right," he called out. "You win. Don't hurt the children." The scarred man grinned, still holding the boy as a shield. "Smart man. Now tell your friend to drop that rifle and come out where we can see him." Washington looked back at Tom and winked. Then, in a voice low enough that only Tom could hear, "When I move, you put that rifle to work. Don't hesitate and don't miss." Tom's blood chilled as he understood what Washington was planning. The man was going to sacrifice himself to give Tom clear shots at the slavers. "Now," the scarred man yelled, "both of you, out in the open." Washington began walking toward the group, hands still raised, looking for all the world like a man who'd accepted defeat. The slavers relaxed slightly, thinking the fight was over. That was their mistake. When Washington was 15 feet away, he suddenly dove forward, rolling under the slaver's gun arm and pulling the child to safety. The man's pistol discharged into empty air, and suddenly Tom had clear targets. His Winchester barked 3 times in rapid succession. The scarred man dropped with a bullet through his chest. Another slaver spun away, his gun arm shattered. A third man tried to run and made it exactly 2 steps before Tom's 4th shot dropped him. The last slaver threw down his weapon and raised his hands. "Don't shoot. I surrender." Washington was back on his feet, his Colt trained on the surviving slaver. "How many more camps like this one?" The man's face was white with terror. I don't know what you mean." Washington shot him in the knee. The man screamed and collapsed, clutching his shattered leg. "Wrong answer," Washington said calmly. "How many more camps?" "3, the man screamed. "3 more. 1 near Amarillo, 1 outside San Antonio, another up near Dallas." "Who's running the operation?" "I don't know. We just get orders and money. Nobody tells us nothing." Washington looked at Tom, who nodded grimly. They both knew this man was telling the truth. He was just hired muscle, not one of the masterminds. Washington's Colt spoke one more time, and the canyon fell silent except for the crying of children and the ringing in Tom's ear. "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed, looking around at the carnage. "Is it over?" "This part is." Washington was already moving toward the children, speaking in soft, reassuring tones as he began unlocking their chains. "But there are 3 more camps out there, and whoever's behind this operation is still free." Tom helped free the children, amazed at their resilience. Despite everything they'd endured, most of them were already looking around with curiosity rather than just fear. Children were tougher than adults gave them credit for. "What happens now?" Tom asked. Washington looked around the camp, taking inventory of the wagons and supplies. "Now we get these kids somewhere safe, and then I continue hunting the men responsible for putting them here." Tom found his horses among the stolen stock, but somehow getting them back didn't seem as important as it had that morning. "You could use help with that hunting." Washington studied his face carefully. "This isn't your fight, Mr. Brennan. You came for your horses, and you got them. You don't owe me anything more." "Maybe not," Tom said, looking at the children they'd just freed. "But I owe them something, and I figure I owe those kids still out there something too." Washington smiled, the first genuine smile Tom had seen from him. "It's dangerous work. No guarantees we'll survive the next camp, let alone 3 of them." Tom thought about that for exactly as long as it took to holster his rifle. "Then we better make sure we don't waste time." As they prepared to move out with their rescued charges, Tom realized that his life as a simple horse rancher was over. He'd seen too much, learned too much, become part of something bigger than stolen livestock. But looking at the faces of the children they'd saved, He couldn't bring himself to regret it. The real fight was just beginning. The town of Cedar Falls had never seen anything like the procession that rode down its main street at sunset. 2 dust-covered men leading a string of 15 children on horseback, their faces telling stories no child should ever have to live. Tom rode beside Washington, acutely aware of how the townspeople stared, a white rancher and a black man, traveling together with a group of rescued children, all of them looking like they'd ridden through hell and barely made it out alive. "Where do we take them?" Tom asked, quiet. Washington pointed toward the modest church at the end of the street. "Pastor Williams is a good man. He'll know what to do." They dismounted in front of the white wooden building, and Washington knocked on the door of the attached parsonage. A middle-aged black man answered, took one look at the children, and immediately began organizing food and shelter without asking a single question about how they'd come to be there. "Samuel," the pastor said warmly, "I was wondering when you'd turn up again." "Hello, Marcus. We need help." "I can see that." Pastor Williams studied Tom with curious eyes. "And you've brought a friend, Tom Brennan. He's been riding with me." The pastor's eyebrows rose slightly, but he simply nodded. "Mr. Brennan, any friend of Samuel's is welcome here." As the children were fed and settled for the night, Tom found himself alone with Washington on the church steps, watching the stars come out over the Texas plains. "3 more camps," Tom said. Washington nodded. "3 that we know of. Could be more." "How long have you been doing this kind of work?" Washington was quiet for a long time, studying the night sky. "My youngest sister was taken when she was 12. This was right after the war, when everything was chaos and nobody was keeping track of missing children, especially not missing black children." Tom waited, knowing there was more to the story. "I spent 5 years looking for her, asked questions in every town from here to New Orleans, followed every rumor, chased every lead, never found so much as a trace. I'm sorry. Found other things though. Found out there were people making money off stolen children, treating them like property to be bought and sold. Found out the law couldn't or wouldn't do anything about it, especially when the victims were black or Indian or Mexican." Washington pulled out his Colt, checked the cylinder, and holstered it again, a nervous habit that spoke of too many dangerous nights. "So I started doing something about it myself. Found people willing to pay for the kind of justice the law couldn't provide. Been at it for 10 years now." Tom thought about that. 10 years of riding into places like Devil's Canyon, facing down armed slavers, risking his life for children he'd never met. It was either the work of a saint or a madman, and Tom wasn't sure there was much difference between the two. "The next camps won't be as easy as this one," Washington continued. "Word will get out about what happened in Devil's Canyon. They'll be ready for us. Maybe, or maybe they'll figure it was just bad luck and keep operating the same way." Washington smiled grimly. "You're learning to think like them. That's dangerous. Is it wrong?" "No. But it changes you. I've been hunting these bastards for a decade, and I can feel how it's changed me. Some nights I look in the mirror, and I'm not sure I recognize the man looking back." Tom understood. The violence in Devil's Canyon had felt necessary, even righteous, but it had also felt too easy. Killing those men hadn't bothered him the way it should have, and that was a troubling realization. So why keep doing it? Washington gestured toward the church, where 15 children were sleeping safely for the first time in weeks or months. Because somebody has to. Because the law can't reach into every corner of this country, and because evil doesn't stop itself. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both men lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Washington spoke again. "You don't have to come with me to the other camps, Tom. You've done more than enough." "I know." Tom stood up, stretched his back, and adjusted his gun belt. "But I'm going anyway." "Why?" Tom thought about the question seriously. Why was he willing to ride into more danger, to kill more men, to risk his own life for strangers he'd never meet? "Because you're right about somebody having to do it, and because I've seen what happens when good people decide it's not their problem." Washington studied his face in the moonlight. "It's not going to be the same as Devil's Canyon. These people know we're coming now. They'll be ready, then we'll have to be ready." The next morning, they left Cedar Falls with fresh supplies and a new sense of purpose. Pastor Williams had promised to see that the rescued children were returned to their families, and he'd also provided Washington with updated information about the remaining camp. Amarillo first, Washington said as they rode north. Cattle town, lots of strangers coming and going, easy place to operate without attracting attention. What do we know about it? More guards, better organized, and they're holding twice as many children as Devil's Canyon. Tom absorbed this information grimly. 30 children, maybe more, all depending on 2 men to set them free. The odds weren't good. We're going to need help, he said. Washington nodded. I've got contacts in Amarillo, men who've lost children, or who've helped me before, but we can't count on anyone else when the shooting starts. They made good time across the open country, pushing their horses hard, but not hard enough to wear them out completely. The landscape gradually changed from broken canyon country to rolling plains, and Tom found himself thinking about his abandoned ranch. His cattle would need tending, his fences would need mending, and there were 100 other chores that couldn't wait indefinite. But every time he thought about turning back, he remembered the faces of those children in Devil's Canyon. What made you decide to help me? Washington asked during a rest stop. Tom considered the question. You mean besides the fact that you knew about my stolen horses, you could have turned me away, could have handled the horse thieves on your own eventually. But you chose to ride with a black stranger into dangerous country. That's not a decision most white men would make in Texas. During the war, I served with some good men. Black men, white men, men who didn't speak much English. Learned that courage doesn't care about the color of a man's skin. And I suppose I never got used to the idea that children should suffer just because adults can't figure out how to treat each other decently. Washington smiled. You're either a very good man, Tom Brennan, or a very naive one. Maybe both. Maybe we'll find out soon enough. As they crested a hill and saw the town of Amarillo spread out before them, Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came before violence. Somewhere in that collection of buildings, children were waiting to be saved, and somewhere else, armed men were waiting to kill anyone who tried to save them. Tom checked his weapons, said a prayer, and followed Samuel Washington down toward the town, where they'd either free 30 children or die trying. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky blood red. The warehouse sat on the outskirts of Amarillo like a cancer, its windows boarded up and its loading dock empty of any legitimate cargo. But Tom could hear voices from inside, and the occasional cry of a child that made his hands clench into fists. 12 guards, Washington whispered from their position behind a stack of lumber. Maybe more inside. They're not taking any chances. Tom studied the building through Washington's field glass. Men with rifles walked regular patrols around the perimeter, and others were positioned at strategic points with clear fields of fire. These weren't the half-drunk saddle tramps they'd faced in Devil's Canyon. These were professionals. How do we get in there? Washington pointed to the rear of the building, where a loading dock offered the only cover-free approach. Back door's our best bet, but we'll have to take out at least 4 guards to get there. And once we start shooting, the whole place will come down on. Tom calculated the odds and didn't like what he came up with. 2 men against 12 or more, in a fortified position, with 30 children caught in the crossfire. It was a recipe for disaster. Maybe we should wait for your contacts, Tom suggested. Washington's expression was grim. They're not coming. Got word this afternoon. 3 of them have disappeared in the last week. Either they're dead, or they've been warned off. So it's just us. Just us. He'd already done more than anyone could reasonably ask, and Samuel Washington's war against the child stealers wasn't really his responsibility. But then he thought about 30 children locked in that warehouse, waiting for salvation that might never come. All right, he said. What's the plan? Washington smiled, and Tom was getting used to that predatory expression. Remember what I told you about desperate times calling for desperate measures? Before Tom could ask what he meant, Washington was already moving, not toward the warehouse but back toward the main street of Amarillo. Tom hurried to catch up, confused and increasingly worried. Where are we going? To get some help. Washington led him to the largest saloon in town, pushed through the batwing doors, and walked straight to the bar. The place was crowded with cowboys, gamblers, and drifters. Exactly the kind of men who might have reasons to hate child stealers. Washington climbed onto a chair and raised his voice above the noise. "My name is Samuel Washington," he called out, and the room gradually fell silent. "And I'm here to tell you that there are 30 children locked in a warehouse on the edge of town, being held by men who plan to sell them like cattle." The silence that followed was deafening. Tom could feel the tension in the room, could see hands moving toward guns, could sense the dangerous shift in mood that came when a black man made accusations in a room full of white strangers. But Washington wasn't finished. "Some of you have lost children," he continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Some of you have sisters or daughters or sons who disappeared one day and never came home. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about." A man near the back of the room stood up slowly. He was maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working cattle. "You got proof of these accusations, boy?" Washington reached into his coat and pulled out a small photograph, held it up for everyone to see. "This is my sister Rebecca. She was 12 when they took her. That was 10 years ago." The photograph passed from hand to hand through the crowd, and Tom could see the effect it was having. These were hard men who'd seen plenty of violence, but the picture of a smiling child seemed to cut through their cynicism. "3 days ago," Washington continued, "my partner and I raided a camp in Devil's Canyon, freed 15 children who were chained like animals, killed the men who were holding them. But we learned there were other camps, other children still waiting." The cowboy who'd spoken first was studying Washington with new interest. "You the ones who shot up Devil's Canyon? Word is 6 men died down there." "6 men who were stealing children," Washington said flatly. "And tonight, there are 12 more men in that warehouse who need killing. Question is, are there any real men in this room who want to help save 30 kids?" The silence stretched out until Tom thought it might break. Then the cowboy stood up completely, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said. "Lost my daughter Sarah 3 years ago. She was 8. His voice cracked slightly. "If what you're saying is true, then I'm in." Another man stood up. "Billy Hendricks. They took my nephew last winter." Then another. "Frank Delacroix. My sister's boy vanished from our ranch 6 months back." Within minutes, half the saloon was on its feet, and Tom realized what Washington had done. He'd found the one thing that could unite a room full of strangers across racial lines: the shared experience of losing a child to predators. "We'll need every gun we can get," Washington said. "These men are professionals, and they won't go down easy." Jake Morrison stepped forward, and Tom could see he was taking charge of the impromptu posse. "How do we know you're telling the truth about that warehouse?" Washington looked at Tom, who nodded and stepped forward. "Because I've seen what these bastards do," Tom said. "I'm Tom Brennan. I run cattle south of here. 3 days ago, this man came to my ranch and told me about stolen horses. Turned out the horses were just bait. The real target was a camp full of stolen children." He described what they'd found in Devil's Canyon, sparing no details about the conditions the children were kept in, or the violence of the men who held them. By the time he finished, the mood in the room had shifted from skeptical to murderous. "All right," Morrison said grimly. "Let's go kill some child stealers." 23 men walked out of that saloon, and Tom had never seen a more dangerous-looking group in his life. Cowboys, gamblers, drifters, shopkeepers, united by rage and armed to the teeth. Washington had turned a suicide mission into an overwhelming force, and he'd done it by appealing to the one thing these men cared about more than racial prejudice: protecting children. The attack on the warehouse was swift and brutal. Morrison's men surrounded the building, while Tom and Washington approached the loading dock from the rear. When the shooting started, it was over in minutes. The guards never had a chance. They'd been expecting 2 men, not 20. They'd prepared for a careful assault, not a frontal attack by a raged mob of fathers and brothers and uncles who'd lost children to predators. Tom kicked in the rear door and found himself face to face with the warehouse's interior: rows of cages holding terrified children, stacks of supplies, and 3 men scrambling for weapons they'd never have time to use. His Winchester spoke 3 times and the men went down hard. Washington was already moving through the cages, using bolt cutters to free the children, while Morrison's men secured the building. The kids were in worse shape than the ones from Devil's Canyon, thinner, more frightened, showing signs of serious abuse. "How many, Tom?" 32, Washington replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Ages 6 to 15, been here anywhere from 2 weeks to 6 months. Tom helped comfort a little girl who couldn't have been more than 7, her eyes wide with terror and hope in equal measure. "It's all right," he told her. "You're safe now. We're taking you home." Outside, Morrison was organizing his men to search the rest of Amarillo for any other slaver operations. The mood was ugly. These men had seen what they'd come to stop, and they weren't in a forgiving frame of mind. "This the end of it?" Morrison asked Washington. "One more camp, near San Antonio. But after tonight, they'll know we're coming." Morrison nodded grimly. "Then we better make sure they don't have time to run." Tom looked around at the impromptu army. Washington had assembled with nothing but a photograph and an appeal to basic human decency. 25 men who'd put aside their differences to save children they'd never met. "You realize what you've started here?" Tom asked Washington quietly. Washington was watching the children being led to safety, and for the first time since Tom had met him, the man looked something approaching peaceful. "Maybe it's time this kind of thing got started," he said. "Maybe it's time ordinary people stopped waiting for someone else to do what's right." As they prepared to ride south toward the final camp, Tom realized that Samuel Washington had done something more than just free 67 children. He'd shown that justice didn't have to wait for badges or courts or official sanction. Sometimes justice just needed people willing to ride into the darkness and light a fire. The war against the child stealers was far from over, but it had found its army, and Tom Brennan was proud to be part of it. 3 days later, when the smoke cleared from the ruins of the San Antonio camp, 89 children were free, and the organized trade in stolen kids was broken across 3 states. Tom never did get back to his ranch. There were always more children who needed saving, more predators who needed stopping, more good men willing to ride toward the sound of gunfire if it meant protecting the innocent. He'd come looking for stolen horses and found something far more valuable, a purpose worth living for, and if necessary dying for. Samuel Washington had been right about one thing. Sometimes you had to ride a long way to do what was right. Sometimes that road never ended, and sometimes that was exactly where a man needed to be.